The Watergate Scandal, a significant political debacle in the United States during President Richard Nixon's administration from 1972 to 1974, ultimately culminated in Nixon's resignation. It originated from the Nixon administration's efforts to conceal its involvement in the June 17, 1972, break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters located in the Watergate office building in Washington, D.C. Following the apprehension of the 5 individuals involved in the break-in, both the media and the Department of Justice traced the seized cash back to the Committee for the Re-election of the President. Subsequent investigations, coupled with revelations from the ensuing trials of the perpetrators, prompted the U.S. House of Representatives to empower the House Judiciary Committee with additional investigative authority to delve into matters within its jurisdiction. Concurrently, the U.S. Senate established the Watergate Committee, which conducted public hearings. Witnesses testified to Nixon's authorization of plans to cover up his administration's role in the burglary, and the existence of a voice-activated taping system in the Oval Office was revealed. Throughout the inquiry, Nixon's administration resisted cooperation, precipitating a constitutional crisis. The Senate Watergate hearings were nationally televised by PBS and captured widespread public interest. In 1973, several significant revelations in Nixon's obstructive actions against the investigation prompted the House to initiate impeachment proceedings against him. In the landmark case of United States v. Nixon, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Nixon must surrender the Oval Office tapes to government investigators. Analysis of the tapes uncovered Nixon's complicity in concealing post-burglary activities and his attempts to divert attention from the investigation through federal officials. The House Judiciary Committee endorsed 3 articles of impeachment against Nixon, citing obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. With the release of the tapes exposing his involvement in the cover-up, Nixon's political support vanished entirely. His impeachment by the House and imminent conviction by the Senate led to his resignation from office under Section 1 of the 25th Amendment on August 9, 1974, making him the sole U.S. president to resign from office. On September 8, 1974, his successor, Gerald Ford, issued a pardon for Nixon. A total of 69 individuals were indicted, and 48 individuals, many of whom were high-ranking officials in the Nixon administration, were convicted. The term Watergate became synonymous with a range of covert and often illicit activities conducted by members of the Nixon administration. These activities included the covert monitoring of the offices of political adversaries and individuals deemed suspicious by Nixon or his associates, the authorization of investigations into activist groups and political figures, and the manipulation of federal agencies such as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, for political purposes. The addition of the suffix «gate» to an identifying term has since become emblematic of public scandal, particularly within the realm of politics. On January 27, 1972, G. Gordon Liddy, the finance counsel for the Committee for the Re-election of the President, CRP, and a former aide to John Ehrlichman, presented a comprehensive campaign intelligence plan to CRP's acting chairman Jeb Stuart Magruder, Attorney General John Mitchell, and Presidential Counsel John Dean. This plan outlined extensive illegal activities targeting the Democratic Party. According to Dean, this event marked the opening scene of the worst political scandal of the 20th century and the beginning of the end of the Nixon presidency. Mitchell initially deemed the plan impractical. However, 2 months later, he approved a scaled-down version of the plan, which included breaking into the Democratic National Committee's, DNC, headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. The objective was to photograph campaign documents and install listening devices in telephones. Although Liddy was ostensibly in charge of the operation, he later claimed to have been deceived by Dean and at least 2 of his subordinates, including former CIA officers E. Howard Hunt and James McCord. McCord, who served as the then CRP security coordinator after Mitchell resigned as Attorney General to chair the CRP, assigned former FBI agent Alfred C. Baldwin III to execute the wiretapping and monitor telephone conversations afterward. McCord testified that he selected Baldwin from a registry published by the FBI's Society of Former Special Agents to work for the committee to re-elect President Nixon. Initially serving as Martha Mitchell's bodyguard, John Mitchell's wife, who resided in Washington, Baldwin accompanied her to Chicago. Eventually, the committee replaced Baldwin with another security personnel. On May 11, McCord arranged for Baldwin, who investigative reporter Jim Hogan described as somehow special and perhaps well known to McCord, to lodge at the Howard Johnson's Motel situated across the street from the Watergate complex. Room 419 was reserved under the name of McCord's company. Following directives from Liddy and Hunt, McCord and his team of burglars made preparations for their initial Watergate break-in, which commenced on May 28. 2 telephones within the DNC headquarters offices were reportedly wiretapped during the operation. One belonged to Robert Spencer Oliver, who served as the executive director of the Association of State Democratic Chairmen at the time. The other phone was assigned to DNC Chairman Larry O'Brien. While the FBI found no evidence of bugs on O'Brien's phone, they confirmed the presence of an effective listening device on Oliver's phone. Despite successfully installing the listening devices, the committee agents soon realized that repairs were necessary, prompting plans for a second burglary to address the issue. In the early hours of Saturday, June 17, 1972, Watergate complex security guard Frank Wills observed tape covering the latches on certain doors within the complex, allowing them to close but remain unlocked. Initially dismissing it as inconsequential, Wills removed the tape. However, upon returning shortly thereafter and discovering that the locks had been retapped, he alerted the police. Responding to the call, an unmarked police car carrying 3 plainclothes officers, Sergeant Paul W. Leeper, Officer John B. Barrett, and Officer Carl M. Schaffler, was dispatched. These officers, known colloquially as the Bum Squad, for their attire and undercover operations, were responsible for addressing street crimes. Meanwhile, Alfred Baldwin, stationed as a lookout at the Howard Johnson's Hotel across the street, was preoccupied watching the film Attack of the Puppet People on TV and failed to notice the arrival of the police car at the Watergate building or the subsequent investigation conducted by the plainclothes officers on the DNC's 6th-floor suite of 29 offices. By the time Baldwin eventually observed suspicious activity on the 6th floor and alerted the burglars via radio, it was too late. The police apprehended 5 individuals, later identified as Virgilio Gonzalez, Bernard Barker, James McCord, Eugenio Martinez, and Frank Sturgis, who were charged with attempted burglary and attempted interception of telephone and other communications. The Washington Post reported the day after the break-in that police had discovered lockpicks, door jimmies, approximately $2,300 in cash, mostly in $100 bills with sequential serial numbers, a shortwave receiver capable of intercepting police calls, 40 rolls of unexposed film, 2 35mm cameras, and 3 pen-sized tear gas guns. Subsequent reporting by the Post revealed that the actual cash amount seized was $5,300. The following morning, Sunday, June 18, G. Gordon Liddy phoned Jeb Magruder in Los Angeles, informing him that the 4 men arrested with McCord were Cuban freedom fighters recruited by Howard Hunt. Initially, Nixon's organization and the White House swiftly moved to conceal the crime and any evidence that could have implicated the president in his re-election campaign. On September 15, 1972, a grand jury indicted the 5 office burglars, along with Hunt and Liddy, on charges of conspiracy, burglary, and violations of federal wiretapping laws. The burglars faced trial before a jury presided over by Judge John Sirica and either pleaded guilty or were convicted by January 30, 1973. Within hours of the burglars' arrest, the FBI uncovered E. Howard Hunt's name in Barker and Martinez's address books. Concerns arose among Nixon administration officials as Hunt and Liddy were also involved in a separate covert operation known as the White House Plumbers, tasked with halting security leaks and probing other sensitive security matters. Dean later testified that top Nixon aide John Ehrlichman instructed him to deep six the contents of Hunt's White House safe, although Ehrlichman denied this. Ultimately, Dean and L. Patrick Gray, the FBI's acting director, separately destroyed evidence from Hunt's safe. Initially, Nixon appeared skeptical of the break-in, as indicated by Watergate prosecutor James Neal, who believed Nixon had no foreknowledge of the incident. Neal cited a taped conversation on June 23 between the president and his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, during which Nixon queried, "Who was the asshole that did that?" However, Nixon subsequently instructed Haldeman to have the CIA hinder the FBI's investigation into the funding source for the burglary. A few days later, Nixon's press secretary, Ron Ziegler, dismissed the event as a third-rate burglary attempt. Then, on August 29, during a news conference, Nixon claimed that Dean had conducted a thorough investigation of the incident, despite Dean not conducting any investigations at all. Furthermore, Nixon asserted, "I can say categorically that no one in the White House staff, no one in this administration, presently employed, was involved in this very bizarre incident." Finally, on September 15, Nixon praised Dean, stating, "The way you've handled it, it seems to me, has been very skillful, because you, putting your fingers in the dikes every time that leaks have sprung here and sprung there." Martha Mitchell, the wife of Nixon's Attorney General, John N. Mitchell, had recently resigned from her role so that he could become the campaign manager for Nixon's Committee for the Re-election of the President, CRP. John Mitchell was aware that Martha knew McCord, one of the Watergate burglars who had been arrested, and he anticipated that her knowledge might link the Watergate burglary to Nixon. Concerned about potential media exposure, John Mitchell instructed guards in her security detail to prevent her from contacting the media. In June 1972, during a phone conversation with United Press International reporter Helen Thomas, Martha Mitchell informed Thomas that she was leaving her husband until he resigned from the CRP. The call abruptly ended. A few days later, veteran crime reporter Marcia Kramer of the New York Daily News located Mitchell at the Westchester Country Club in Rye, New York, and described her as a beaten woman with visible bruises. Mitchell recounted being held captive in a hotel in California during the week following the Watergate burglary. She claimed that security guard Steve King terminated her call to Thomas by disconnecting the phone cord from the wall. Mitchell made several attempts to escape via the balcony but was physically restrained, injured, and forcibly sedated by a psychiatrist. McCord later confessed in February 1975, following his conviction for his role in the Watergate burglary, that Mitchell had been, basically kidnapped, corroborating her version of events. On June 19, 1972, the press revealed that one of the Watergate burglars was a Republican Party security aide. John Mitchell, then the head of the CRP, denied any involvement with the Watergate break-in and disavowed any knowledge of the 5 burglars. On August 1, a $25,000, equivalent to approximately $175,000 in 2022 dollars, cashier's check was discovered to have been deposited into the U.S. and Mexican bank accounts of one of the Watergate burglars, Bernard Barker. The check, made out to the Finance Committee of the Committee to Re-elect the President, was a 1972 campaign donation from Kenneth H. Dahlberg. This money, along with several other checks lawfully donated to the CRP, was directly used to finance the burglary and wiretapping expenses, including hardware and supplies. Barker's various national and international businesses maintained separate bank accounts, which he attempted to use to obscure the true origin of the funds paid to the burglars. The donors' checks provided evidence of the burglars' direct connection to the Finance Committee of the CRP. Donations amounting to $86,000, equivalent to $602,000 today, were contributed by individuals under the impression that they were making private donations through certified and cashier's checks for the president's re-election campaign. Upon investigation, it was discovered that a Miami company operated by Watergate burglar Barker had deposited a check into an account under his personal control and subsequently transferred it through the Federal Reserve check clearing system. The FBI's inquiry, which absolved Barker's bank of fiduciary misconduct, directly implicated members of the CRP who had received the checks. Specifically, the committee's bookkeeper and treasurer, Hugh Sloan, were implicated. As a private entity, the committee adhered to standard business practices by permitting only duly authorized individuals to accept and endorse checks on its behalf. Financial institutions were prohibited from processing checks for the committee unless endorsed by an authorized individual. The checks deposited into Barker's account were endorsed by committee treasurer Hugh Sloan, authorized by the Finance Committee. However, Sloan, upon endorsing a check payable to the committee, bore a legal and fiduciary obligation to ensure its deposit into designated committee accounts, which he failed to fulfill. Faced with potential federal bank fraud charges, Sloan disclosed that committee deputy director Jeb Magruder and finance director Maurice Stans had instructed him to channel the funds to G. Gordon Liddy. Liddy, in turn, disbursed the funds to Barker and endeavored to conceal their origin. Barker attempted to disguise the funds by depositing them into overseas bank accounts. Unbeknownst to Barker, Liddy, and Sloan, a comprehensive record of all transactions was retained for approximately 6 months. Barker's utilization of foreign banks in April and May 1972 to deposit checks and withdraw funds through cashier's checks and money orders resulted in the banks retaining complete transaction records until October and November 1972. All 5 Watergate burglars had direct or indirect ties to the 1972 CRP, prompting Judge Sirica to suspect a conspiracy involving high-ranking government officials. On September 29, 1972, it was reported that John Mitchell, while serving as Attorney General, oversaw a covert Republican fund used for intelligence gathering against Democrats. On October 10, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of The Washington Post revealed that the FBI had concluded that the Watergate break-in was part of an extensive campaign of political espionage and sabotage on behalf of the Nixon re-election committee. Despite these revelations, Nixon's campaign remained largely unscathed, and on November 7, the president was re-elected in one of the largest landslides in American political history. The media, particularly The Washington Post, Time, and The New York Times, brought attention to the connection between the break-in and the re-election committee through investigative coverage. This heightened publicity resulted in significant political and legal consequences. Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, heavily reliant on anonymous sources, uncovered information suggesting that knowledge of the break-in and attempts to cover it up reached into the upper echelons of the Justice Department, FBI, CIA, and the White House. Judy Hoback Miller, the bookkeeper for Nixon's re-election campaign, disclosed to Woodward and Bernstein details about fund mismanagement and the destruction of records. The primary anonymous source for the Post, dubbed Deep Throat by Woodward and Bernstein, was later revealed in 2005 as Mark Felt, deputy director of the FBI at the time. Felt clandestinely met with Woodward, revealing Howard Hunt's involvement in the Watergate break-in and conveying the White House's high stakes in the scandal. Felt cautioned Woodward about the FBI's interest in the journalist's sources, as they were uncovering a broader network of crimes. Secret meetings between Woodward and Felt occurred in an underground parking garage in Rosslyn from June 1972 to January 1973. Before resigning from the FBI in June 1973, Felt anonymously leaked information about Watergate to Time magazine, the Washington Daily News, and other publications. During the early stages of the scandal, much of the media failed to grasp its full significance, focusing instead on other aspects of the 1972 presidential election. Many outlets disregarded or downplayed Woodward and Bernstein's revelations. Some newspapers, like the crosstown Washington Star-News and the Los Angeles Times, even ran stories erroneously discrediting the Post's reporting. After the Post disclosed H.R. Haldeman's involvement in the secret fund, newspapers such as the Chicago Tribune and the Philadelphia Inquirer chose not to publish the information but did print the White House's denial the following day. The White House sought to undermine the Post's coverage by attacking it relentlessly while refraining from criticizing similarly damaging stories from other outlets like the New York Times and Time magazine. Following revelations that one of the convicted burglars had written to Judge Sirica alleging a high-level cover-up, the media shifted its focus. Time magazine described Nixon as enduring daily hell and very little trust. The strained relationship between the press and the Nixon administration, exacerbated by lingering dissatisfaction from the Vietnam War era, was marked by mutual distrust, with public distrust of the media polling at over 40%. Nixon and top administration officials deliberated on utilizing government agencies to retaliate against perceived hostile media organizations, a tactic employed previously. At Nixon's White House's behest in 1969, the FBI tapped the phones of 5 reporters. In 1971, the White House requested an audit of the tax return of the editor of Newsday following his investigative series on the financial dealings of Charles B.B. Rebozo, a Nixon confidant. The administration and its supporters accused the media of making wild accusations, sensationalizing the story, and displaying a liberal bias against the administration. Nixon asserted in a May 1974 interview with supporter Baruch Korf that had he followed the liberal policies favored by the media, Watergate would have been a blip. Despite such allegations, the media's reporting was largely accurate, driven by the competitive nature of the industry, ensuring extensive coverage of the sprawling political scandal. Rather than culminating with the conviction and sentencing of the 5 Watergate burglars on January 30, 1973, the investigation into the break-in and the Nixon administration's involvement expanded. Nixon's conversations in late March and April 1973 revealed his awareness of the need to distance himself from Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Dean, without incriminating himself or his presidency. This led to a new conspiracy, a cover-up of the cover-up, which took shape in late March 1973 and persisted until Nixon's resignation on August 9, 1974. On March 23, 1973, Judge Sirica disclosed a letter from Watergate burglar James McCord alleging perjury in the trial and pressuring defendants to remain silent. In an effort to compel their cooperation, Sirica imposed provisional sentences of up to 40 years on Hunt and 2 other burglars. At Nixon's urging on March 28, aide John Ehrlichman informed Attorney General Richard Kleindienst that no one in the White House had prior knowledge of the burglary. Subsequently, on April 13, Magruder confessed to U.S. attorneys that he had committed perjury during the burglars' trial and implicated John Dean and John Mitchell. John Dean held the belief that he, along with Mitchell, Ehrlichman, and Haldeman, could approach prosecutors, reveal the truth, and potentially save the presidency. Dean's intention was to shield the president while allowing his 4 closest associates to take responsibility for disclosing the truth. During a crucial meeting with Nixon on April 15, 1973, Dean remained unaware of the depth of the president's knowledge and involvement in the Watergate cover-up. It was during this encounter that Dean sensed he was being recorded, based on Nixon's manner of speaking and attempts to evoke recollections of earlier conversations about fundraising. Dean later highlighted this observation while testifying before the Senate Committee on Watergate, revealing the existence of taped conversations that would unravel the conspiracy. 2 days later, Dean informed Nixon of his cooperation with the U.S. attorneys. Simultaneously, the U.S. attorneys informed Nixon that Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Dean, and other White House officials were implicated in the cover-up. On April 30, Nixon requested the resignations of Haldeman and Ehrlichman, 2 of his most influential aides, both of whom were later indicted, convicted, and sentenced to prison. He also sought the resignation of Attorney General Kleindienst to avoid any implication of conflict arising from his friendship with Haldeman and Ehrlichman. Additionally, Nixon dismissed White House counsel John Dean, who subsequently testified before the Senate Watergate Committee, expressing his belief and suspicion that conversations in the Oval Office were being recorded. This revelation served as a pivotal moment leading to Richard Nixon's resignation, averting impeachment. In his writings for New West and New York magazines in 1977, Ehrlichman asserted that Nixon had offered him a substantial sum of money, which he turned down. Addressing the American people, the president made the following announcement regarding the resignations. Today, in one of the most challenging decisions of my presidency, I have accepted the resignations of two of my closest associates in the White House, Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, two exemplary public servants whom it has been my honor to know. Opening square bracket ... closing square bracket. Additionally, due to Attorney General Kleindienst's long-standing association with some individuals involved in this case, although he himself has no personal involvement, both he and I agreed that it was necessary to appoint a new Attorney General. Furthermore, the counsel to the President, John Dean, has also tendered his resignation. On the same day, April 30th, Nixon appointed Elliot Richardson as the new Attorney General and granted him the authority to select a special counsel for the Watergate investigation independent of the regular Justice Department hierarchy. In May 1973, Richardson appointed Archibald Cox to the position. On February 7, 1973, the United States Senate unanimously voted 77-0 to pass Resolution 60 and establish a select committee to probe into Watergate, with Sam Ervin appointed as chairman the following day. The Senate committee hearings, featuring testimonies from Dean and other former administration officials, were broadcast from May 17 to August 7. The three major television networks alternated in covering the hearings live, ensuring continuous coverage every third day, starting with ABC on May 17 and concluding with NBC on August 7. An estimated 85% of Americans with television sets tuned in to at least one segment of the hearings. During an initial interview on Friday, July 13, Deputy Minority Counsel Donald Sanders queried White House Assistant Alexander Butterfield about the presence of any recording system in the White House. Initially hesitant to respond, Butterfield eventually admitted the existence of a new system in the White House that automatically recorded conversations in the Oval Office, the Cabinet Room, and elsewhere, including Nixon's private office in the old Executive Office Building. On Monday, July 16, before a live televised audience, Chief Minority Counsel Fred Thompson queried Butterfield about any knowledge regarding the installation of listening devices in the Oval Office of the President. Butterfield's revelation of the taping system marked a pivotal moment in the Watergate investigation. Cox promptly issued subpoenas for the tapes, as did the Senate, but Nixon refused to release them, citing executive privilege, and instructed Cox to withdraw his subpoena. Cox declined. On October 20, 1973, following Cox's refusal to withdraw the subpoena, Nixon directed Attorney General Elliot Richardson to dismiss him. Richardson resigned in protest instead of carrying out the directive. Nixon then instructed Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus to dismiss Cox, but Ruckelshaus also resigned rather than comply. Nixon's quest to find someone in the Justice Department willing to dismiss Cox ended with Solicitor General Robert Bork. While Bork acknowledged the validity and appropriateness of Nixon's order, he contemplated resigning to avoid being perceived as sacrificing principles to safeguard his position. Ultimately, Bork executed the presidential directive and terminated the special prosecutor. These actions faced significant public backlash. Responding to allegations of potential wrongdoing, Nixon adamantly declared, "Well, I am not a crook," in front of 400 Associated Press managing editors at Disney's Contemporary Resort on November 17, 1973. Subsequently, Nixon needed to authorize Bork to appoint a new special prosecutor. With Nixon's consent, Bork selected Leon Jaworski to continue the investigation. On March 1, 1974, a grand jury in Washington, D.C., indicted several former Nixon aides, collectively known as the Watergate Seven: H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, John N. Mitchell, Charles Colson, Gordon C. Strawn, Robert Mardian, and Kenneth Parkinson, for conspiring to obstruct the Watergate investigation. While the grand jury secretly named Nixon as an unindicted co-conspirator, the special prosecutor dissuaded them from indicting Nixon, arguing that a sitting president could only be indicted after leaving office. Prior to this, John Dean, Jeb Stuart Magruder, and other individuals had pleaded guilty. On April 5, 1974, Dwight Chapin, the former Nixon Appointments Secretary, was convicted of perjury before the grand jury. 2 days later, the same grand jury indicted Ed Reinecke, the Republican Lieutenant Governor of California, on 3 counts of perjury before the Senate committee. The Nixon administration grappled with the decision of which materials to release, with all parties agreeing that all relevant information should be disclosed. However, the issue of whether to release unedited profanity and vulgarity caused division among his advisors. While his legal team advocated for releasing the tapes unedited, Press Secretary Ron Ziegler preferred an edited version where expletive deleted would replace the raw material. After weeks of deliberation, they opted for an edited version. Nixon announced the release of the transcripts in a national address on April 29, 1974, noting that any audio containing national security information could be redacted from the tapes. Initially, Nixon received a positive response for his speech. However, as people read the transcripts over the following weeks, former supporters from the public, media, and political community began calling for Nixon's resignation or impeachment. Vice President Gerald Ford remarked, "While it may be easy to delete characterization from the printed page, we cannot delete characterization from people's minds with a wave of the hand." Senate Republican leader Hugh Scott described the transcripts as revealing a deplorable, disgusting, shabby, and immoral performance by the president and his former aides. House Republican leader John Jacob Rhodes echoed Scott's sentiments, suggesting that if Nixon's position continued to deteriorate, he should consider resigning as a possible option. The editors of the Chicago Tribune, a newspaper that had previously supported Nixon, criticized him, stating, "He is humorless to the point of being inhumane. He is devious. He is vacillating. He is profane. He is willing to be led. He displays dismaying gaps in knowledge. He is suspicious of his staff. His loyalty is minimal." The Providence Journal described the experience of reading the transcripts as nauseating, emphasizing that while they may not have revealed an indictable offense, they displayed Nixon's contempt for the United States, its institutions, and its people. Time magazine reported that Republican Party leaders in the western U.S., while acknowledging a significant number of Nixon loyalists within the party, believed that Nixon should step down quickly due to the offensive language and vindictive tone evident in the transcripts. The issue of access to the tapes reached the United States Supreme Court. On July 24, 1974, in United States v. Nixon, the court ruled unanimously, 8-0, that claims of executive privilege over the tapes were invalid. Then Justice William Rehnquist, who had recently been appointed to the court by Nixon and most recently served in the Nixon Justice Department as Assistant Attorney General of the Office of Legal Counsel, recused himself from the case. The court ordered the president to release the tapes to the special prosecutor. Nixon complied with the order on July 30, 1974, and released the subpoenaed tapes to the public. The tapes revealed crucial conversations between the president and his counsel, John Dean, on March 21, 1973. Dean summarized various aspects of the Watergate case and focused on the subsequent cover-up, referring to it as a cancer on the presidency. He discussed the hush money being paid to the burglary team for their silence, implicating key figures such as Bob Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, and himself. Dean also mentioned Howard Hunt's blackmailing of the White House for immediate money. Nixon responded by agreeing to address Hunt's financial situation promptly, indicating a desire to contain the situation. During the initial congressional proceedings, it was unclear if Nixon had known and approved of the payments to the Watergate defendants before this conversation. However, Nixon's conversation with Haldeman on August 1 confirmed his prior knowledge and approval of the payments, stating unequivocally, "They have to be paid." This acknowledgement was considered an affirmative act to obstruct justice during the congressional debate on impeachment. On December 7, investigators discovered that an 18.5-minute portion of one recorded tape had been erased. Nixon's longtime personal secretary, Rose Mary Woods, claimed she had accidentally erased the tape while answering the phone. However, forensic analysis in 2003 revealed that the erasure occurred in multiple segments, casting doubt on Woods's explanation. Nixon's position grew increasingly precarious. On February 6, 1974, the House of Representatives approved House Resolution 803, granting the Judiciary Committee authority to investigate the impeachment of the president. On July 27, 1974, the House Judiciary Committee voted 27-11 to recommend the first article of impeachment against Nixon, obstruction of justice. The committee recommended the second article, abuse of power, on July 29, 1974. The following day, July 30, 1974, the committee recommended the third article, contempt of Congress. On August 20, 1974, the House authorized the printing of the committee report House Report 93-1305, detailing the resolution impeaching Nixon and setting forth articles of impeachment against him. On August 5, 1974, the White House released a previously unknown audio tape from June 23, 1972. Recorded shortly after the break-in, it captured the early stages of the cover-up. Nixon and Haldeman were heard discussing how to impede the FBI's investigation of the break-in, recognizing the potential threat to their involvement in the scandal. Haldeman broached the subject, stating, quote, "The The Democratic break-in thing, we're back to the problem area because the FBI is not under control, because Gray doesn't exactly know how to control them, and they have. Their investigation is now leading into some productive areas. And it goes in some directions we don't want it to go. After detailing how the money from CRP was traced to the burglars, Haldeman outlined the cover-up plan to Nixon. The way to handle this now is for us to have Walters, CIA, call Pat Gray, FBI, and just say, stay the hell out of this. This is business here, we don't want you to go any further on it. Nixon endorsed the plan, and upon learning more about his campaign's involvement in the break-in, he told Haldeman, all right, fine, I understand it all. We won't second-guess Mitchell and the rest. Reiterating the use of the CIA to obstruct the FBI, he instructed Haldeman, you call them in. Good deal. Play it tough. That's the way they play it, and that's the way we are going to play it. Nixon argued that his actions did not constitute obstruction of justice, as they ultimately led the CIA to truthfully inform the FBI that no national security issues were at stake. He encouraged the FBI to continue its investigation despite their concerns about potential interference. Prior to the release of this tape, Nixon had consistently denied any involvement in the scandal. He insisted that his instructions to the CIA were devoid of political motives and claimed ignorance of senior campaign officials' involvement before March 21, 1973, including that of John Mitchell. However, the tape's contents convinced Nixon's own attorneys, Fred Buzhardt and James Street Clair, that the president had deceived the nation, his closest aides, and his legal counsel, for over 2 years. Termed the smoking gun by Barbara Conable, the tape proved Nixon's complicity in the cover-up from the outset. In the days preceding Nixon's resignation, Ehrlichman and Haldeman unsuccessfully lobbied for pardons promised by Nixon prior to their resignations in April 1973. The release of the smoking gun tape dealt a fatal blow to Nixon's political career. The 10 congressmen who had initially voted against all 3 articles of impeachment in the House Judiciary Committee announced their support for the impeachment article accusing Nixon of obstructing justice when the articles were presented to the full House. Additionally, John Jacob Rhodes, the House leader of Nixon's party, declared his intention to vote for impeachment, asserting that cover-up of criminal activity and misuse of federal agencies cannot be condoned or tolerated. On the evening of August 7, 1974, Senators Barry Goldwater and Hugh Scott, along with Congressman Rhodes, met with Nixon in the Oval Office. Scott and Rhodes, leaders of the Republican Party in the Senate and House respectively, were accompanied by Goldwater, who was revered as an elder statesman. They conveyed to Nixon that his support in Congress had virtually evaporated. Rhodes bluntly informed Nixon that he faced certain impeachment once the articles were put to a vote in the full House. Reportedly, no more than 75 representatives were willing to oppose impeaching Nixon for obstructing justice. Goldwater and Scott, in turn, informed the president that there were enough votes in the Senate to convict him, with fewer than 15 senators willing to vote for acquittal, far short of the 34 votes required to remain in office. Confronted with the certainty of impeachment and removal from office, and with public sentiment firmly against him, Nixon opted to step down. In a televised address from the Oval Office on the evening of August 8, 1974, he stated, "In all my decisions throughout my public service, I have endeavored to act in the best interest of our nation. During the challenging period of Watergate, I believed it was my duty to persist, to exert every effort to fulfill the term of office entrusted to me by the American people. However, recent events have made it clear to me that I no longer possess a sufficient political foundation in Congress to justify continuing this endeavor. As long as such support existed, I firmly believed it was imperative to see the constitutional process through to its conclusion. Foregoing any other course would betray the essence of that painstaking process and set a perilous precedent for the future. Though I would have preferred to endure whatever personal anguish it might have entailed and my family unanimously urged me to do so, the welfare of our nation must always take precedence over personal considerations. Following discussions with congressional and other leaders, it has become apparent that due to the Watergate matter, I may not command the congressional support necessary to make the arduous decisions and fulfill the duties of this office in the manner demanded by the nation's interests. I have never been one to retreat. Departing office before completing my term is contrary to every fiber of my being. Yet, as president, I must prioritize the welfare of America. America requires a president and Congress fully dedicated to addressing the pressing issues we face, both domestically and internationally. Continuing to contest for my exoneration in the months ahead would consume the time and attention of both the President and Congress at a juncture when our focus should be squarely on significant matters of peace abroad and economic stability at home. Therefore, I hereby announce my resignation from the presidency, effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will take the oath of office as president in this office at that time. On the morning that marked the beginning of his resignation, President Nixon bid farewell to the White House staff in the East Room, accompanied by Mrs. Nixon and their family. They were transported from the White House to Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland via helicopter. Reflecting on the moment, Nixon later pondered, as the helicopter moved on to Andrews, "I found myself thinking not of the past, but of the future. What could I do now?" From Andrews, they boarded an Air Force plane bound for El Toro Marine Corps Air Station in California, eventually reaching their home, La Casa Pacifica, in San Clemente. Following Nixon's resignation, Congress ceased its impeachment proceedings, although the possibility of federal criminal prosecution remained. Vice President Gerald Ford assumed the presidency, and on September 8, 1974, issued a full and unconditional pardon for Nixon, shielding him from prosecution for any crimes committed during his presidency. In a televised address to the nation, Ford justified the pardon as being in the country's best interest, describing the Nixon family's situation as an American tragedy, and emphasizing the need to bring closure to the ordeal. Ford stated, "I have concluded that only I can do that, and if I can, I must." Nixon maintained his innocence until his death in 1994. In his official response to the pardon, he acknowledged that he should have taken more decisive action in addressing the Watergate scandal, particularly as it evolved into a national tragedy during judicial proceedings. Some analysts argue that Ford's decision to pardon Nixon may have contributed to his defeat in the 1976 presidential election. Allegations of a secret agreement between Ford and Nixon, involving a pardon in exchange for resignation, prompted Ford to testify before the House Judiciary Committee on October 17, 1974. In his autobiography, A Time to Heal, Ford recounted a meeting with Nixon's chief of staff, Alexander Haig, during which Haig outlined Nixon's limited options. Nixon could either attempt to endure the impeachment process and challenge conviction in the Senate, or opt to resign. Haig presented several scenarios for resignation: delaying the resignation until later in the impeachment proceedings, seeking a censure vote from Congress, or pardoning himself before resigning. Haig mentioned that some of Nixon's staff had suggested the possibility of Nixon resigning in exchange for Ford pardoning him. Haig clarified that these were not his own recommendations, refraining from identifying the staff members involved and emphasizing that he did not advocate for any particular option. Instead, he sought Ford's assessment of the situation and any suggestions for the president's course of action. Ford declined to make any recommendations, believing it would be improper to do so. In a separate development, Charles Colson pleaded guilty to charges related to the Daniel Ellsberg case, resulting in the dismissal of the indictment against him for covering up the activities of the committee to re-elect the president, as was the case for Strawn. The trial for the remaining 5 members of the Watergate 7 indicted in March commenced in October 1974. On January 1, 1975, all but Parkinson were convicted. However, in 1976, the U.S. Court of Appeals ordered a new trial for Mardian, leading to the dismissal of all charges against him. Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Mitchell exhausted their appeals in 1977, with Ehrlichman entering prison in 1976 and the other 2 following suit in 1977. Given that Nixon and many senior officials embroiled in the Watergate scandal were lawyers, the incident significantly tarnished the public perception of the legal profession. The fallout from the Watergate scandal led to the indictment of 69 individuals, with 48 ultimately being found guilty. To address the public's call for direct federal regulation of lawyers, the American Bar Association, ABA, initiated 2 major reforms. Firstly, recognizing the shortcomings of its existing Model Code of Professional Responsibility, which was established in 1969, the ABA replaced it with the Model Rules of Professional Conduct in 1983. These model rules have since been adopted, either partially or entirely, by all 50 states. The preamble of the model rules emphasizes the importance of lawyers' proper conduct to maintain self-governance within the legal profession. Secondly, the ABA implemented a requirement that law students at ABA-approved law schools undergo a course in professional responsibility, which entails studying the model rules. This requirement remains in force. In June 1975, Nixon provided secret testimony to a grand jury over the course of 2 days. News reports at the time indicated that Nixon responded to inquiries regarding the 18.5-minute gap in the tapes, alterations made to White House tape transcripts submitted to the House Judiciary Committee, alleged use of the Internal Revenue Service to target political adversaries, and a $100,000 contribution from billionaire Howard Hughes. Assisted by the Public Citizen Litigation Group, historian Stanley Cutler, known for his works on Nixon and Watergate, including successful lawsuits leading to the public release of the Nixon White House tapes in 1996, filed a lawsuit to obtain the transcripts of Nixon's grand jury testimony. On July 29, 2011, U.S. District Judge Royce Lamberth granted Cutler's request, prioritizing historical interests over privacy concerns, especially considering the deceased status of Nixon and other key figures, and the fact that most surviving individuals had already provided sworn testimony, been extensively written about, or participated in interviews. Although the transcripts were initially withheld pending a potential government appeal, they were ultimately released in full on November 10, 2011, with the names of living individuals redacted. Luke Nichter, a professor at Texas A&M University Central Texas, petitioned the chief judge of the federal court in Washington to unseal hundreds of pages of sealed records related to the Watergate 7. In June 2012, the U.S. Department of Justice informed the court that it had no objection to their release, with certain exceptions. Consequently, on November 2, 2012, federal judge Royce Lamberth ordered the unsealing of Watergate trial records for G. Gordon Liddy and James McCord. According to Thomas J. Johnson, a journalism professor at the University of Texas at Austin, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger expressed during Nixon's final days that history would view Nixon as a great president and that Watergate would eventually be minimized as a minor footnote. Following Congress's investigation into the extent of presidential legal powers, it was discovered that consecutive administrations since 1950 had continuously declared the United States to be in a state of emergency. In response, Congress passed the National Emergencies Act in 1976 to regulate such declarations. The impact of the Watergate scandal on the national and international psyche was profound, leading subsequent scandals to be suffixed with "Gate." The revelations of Watergate, implicating the Republican Party and Nixon, strongly influenced the outcome of the November 1974 Senate and House elections, which occurred 3 months after Nixon's resignation. The Democrats gained 5 Senate seats and 49 House seats, earning them the moniker Watergate Babies. This led to the passage of legislation addressing campaign financing, amending the Freedom of Information Act, and requiring financial disclosures by key government officials through the Ethics in Government Act. Although not legally mandated, disclosing recent income tax forms became customary. Additionally, the practice of recording presidential conversations, which had been ongoing since Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidency, purportedly ceased after Watergate. Ford's decision to pardon Nixon significantly contributed to his defeat in the 1976 presidential election against Jimmy Carter. In 1977, Nixon sought to improve his tarnished legacy by arranging an interview with British journalist David Frost. Believing Frost would be an easy interviewer based on a prior encounter in 1968, Nixon was surprised by Frost's probing questions. The interview exposed the entire scandal to the American people, and although Nixon formally apologized, his legacy remained stained. The 2008 film Frost, Nixon portrays this media event. In the aftermath of Watergate, the phrase, "follow the money," became ingrained in American culture and is often attributed to Mark Felt's advice to Woodward and Bernstein. Although the phrase was not used in the 1974 book All the President's Men, it became associated with it after the release of the film adaptation in 1976. The 2017 movie Mark Felt, The Man Who Brought Down the White House explores Felt's role in the scandal and his identity as Deep Throat. The parking garage in Rosslyn where Woodward and Felt met still stands as a historic site. In 2011, Arlington County commemorated its significance with a historical marker. However, plans to demolish the garage as part of an apartment building construction were announced in 2017, with developers pledging to preserve the site's historical importance within the new complex. Despite the profound impact of the Watergate scandal, the exact motive behind the break-in at the DNC offices has never been definitively determined. Records from the United States v. Liddy trial, released in 2013, revealed that 4 of the 5 burglars testified they were instructed to find evidence linking Cuban funding to Democratic campaigns. While the long-standing theory suggests the target was DNC Chairman Larry O'Brien's offices, his name was absent from Alfred C. Baldwin III's list of targets released in 2013. The list included senior DNC official R. Spencer Oliver, Oliver's secretary Ida Maxine Wells, coworker Robert Allen, and secretary Barbara Kennedy. Drawing from these revelations, Texas A&M history professor Luke Nichter, who successfully advocated for the release of this information, contested Woodward and Bernstein's conclusion, largely based on Watergate burglar James McCord's testimony, that the break-in aimed to bug O'Brien's phone for political and financial intelligence on the Democrats. Nichter aligned with late journalist J. Anthony Lucas of the New York Times, who asserted that the committee sought evidence linking the Democrats to prostitution, alleging that Oliver's office facilitated such meetings. Nonetheless, Nichter acknowledged that Woodward and Bernstein's theory of O'Brien as the target remained unverified without disclosure of Baldwin's bugging transcripts. In 1968, O'Brien was appointed by Vice President Hubert Humphrey as the national director of his presidential campaign and, separately, by Howard Hughes as his public policy lobbyist in Washington. O'Brien served as the national chairman of the DNC in 1968 and 1970. In late 1971, the president's brother, Donald Nixon, sought intelligence on O'Brien, having previously borrowed $205,000 from Howard Hughes, a loan that became a political liability during the 1960 presidential campaign. Richard Nixon, eager to avoid further embarrassment, withdrew funds from the Texas National Bank of Commerce between 1968 and 1970, including contributions to Democratic and Republican candidates, including Humphrey and Nixon himself. Despite Hughes' desire for Donald Nixon's involvement in political matters, Nixon opposed it. Meyer informed Donald Nixon that Democrats possessed incriminating information regarding Richard Nixon's dealings with Hughes, stored with Larry O'Brien. According to Fred Emery, O'Brien's lobbying for Hughes in a Democrat-controlled Congress posed a risk of uncovering Hughes' illegal contributions to Nixon's campaign, prompting Nixon's concern. James F. Neal, who prosecuted the Watergate 7, doubted Nixon's involvement in ordering the break-in due to Nixon's apparent surprise upon learning about it.